Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, researchers from Africa and from all around the world, good morning. My name is Dr. Morne Mostert. I'll be your host for this morning's webinar, and welcome to the very first Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development webinar for 2024. We're enormously excited to have you here. We're being joined today by delegates, guests from over 20 countries from all around the world. And we're tremendously pleased that we could share the kind of thought leadership that Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development develops and promotes and inspires in all its clients. Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development prides itself on its expertise in executive development and tailored uniquely, very importantly, to the context in which we operate here in Africa. With its vast potential, its rich diversity. We know, of course, that Africa has this tremendous wealth. And simultaneously, we know the opposite can also be true. A continent rich with contradiction, one might say. Almost anything you can say about the continent, one might argue the opposite. And there would be examples of where this would be true. And it would be for that reason, this inherent quality of contradiction and complexity, that we explore both risks and opportunities for African leaders at our webinar today. I'm joined also here in the studio by two very prominent thought leaders, Dr. Njeri Mwagiru and Dr. Ekene Onwu, and I'll talk about them just a little bit later. But to you, our guests, our participants, may I extend this invitation that you join us in exploring the intricacies that present in the challenges and opportunities of Africa. And please do so by leaving in the chat your comments, your observations, your thoughts, and your questions. We're very keen to learn from you. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been honored this morning in an invitation from Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development to share some thoughts on some of my own recent research. As many of you know that I'm a member of the faculty and pleased to be one at Executive Development. And I do so particularly on the fields of strategic foresight, innovation, creativity, and systems thinking. In the heart of COVID, the Finland Futures Research Centre developed a particular interest in Africa and published a focused publication on the challenges and opportunities facing the continent. I was privileged to be invited to contribute to that important publication by one of the world's leading futures research institutes, and I'll be sharing a model developed in an attempt at sense-making in Africa, published in that publication. First, I must tell you, in Finnish. I'm not sure what your Finnish is like, but I'm pleased to say that the paper was published in Finnish and will soon appear in English. So, with your indulgence, let me get straight into it and share with you an attempt at sense-making on the complexities facing all of us in Africa. You'll see on your screen the front cover of that publication. And I was extremely pleased that they were willing to publish the title in the way that I had proposed. The title being Goldilokshin and the Three Bears, a narrative architecture perspective for African foresight. It's worth perhaps pausing on the nomenclature in the title of the paper, and I'll explore that in a bit more detail with you. The first observation, perhaps, is that many from those of you from the African continent will recognize the word lokshin, a contracted form of the word location, a word developed during a very dark time in the history of South Africa. Contracted form of the English word location, meaning place, but a place of particular horror, of the kind of qualities that Africa is often associated with, of poverty, often of crime, often of unemployment and a lack of opportunity. And it was my endeavor in this paper to contribute to work on perspectives of Africa by linking this shadow side of the African continent with the golden locks, often typical, associated with the more European perspective. And so that's the first idea in the conceptualization of our sharing with you here today. And that is the link between some of the challenges of Africa and the European perspectives that often dominate as we think about our continent. And then, very importantly, to think about a narrative architecture, a story design, a structure in which we may rethink the way in which we conceptualize our perspectives of Africa, and of course, from an African foresight perspective. So a word or two, just very briefly, on the nature of narrative, of story. The first thing perhaps to observe there is that stories have a directional arc. In other words, they start somewhere. And as well-known thinkers in Africa have observed well before me, the story of Africa sounds very different depending on where you start to tell it. If you tell it starting with the Berlin Conference in the 1850s, for example, the story suddenly looks very different from if you were to start it a few thousand years ago, or if you were indeed to start it this morning. So that narrative arc of the story of Africa is an important one, and I'll share with you some core constructs on how we can think about that. The second beauty of the methodology of narrative is that it is often non-linear. You are all familiar with many stories from your childhood that present this element of surprise. You can just imagine, the classic story set in the deep, dark woods. Things are going along swimmingly when suddenly something occurs that surprises us all. And Africa certainly has that in its architecture. Narratives also present a fluid structure. Narrative stories are not spreadsheets, I'm very pleased to say. And so in this morning's webinar, we'll also explore the beauty, the value of thinking of alternative stories of Africa, inspired, as some of you may recognize, by some of the work of well-known author Chimamanda Adichie. And then just a word or two on complexity. Etymologically taken as it is from the Latin com meaning together and plexere meaning to weave. The complexity of Africa, therefore, can be considered as the weaving together of multiple polarities, often contradictory qualities, and narrative, story, gives us the opportunity for exploring these contradictions. So many of you will be familiar with the European story of Goldilocks and the three bears. Goldilocks, a young European girl, ventures into the woods. The woods in narrative archetypes are often symbolic of uncertainty, of exploration, of facing a degree of risk, of venturing out in search of what no one knows quite what we will find. I was inspired by this idea because it is not unlike the way in which many investors in Africa view the continent. Mysterious, unpredictable, filled with potential riches, but also riddled with complexity. So Goldilocks in our webinar today represents a European perspective, written, as you can see there, by Robert Southey in the early 1900s. The story, as you may remember, is that Goldilocks sets out into the forest. Of course, she gets lost and stumbles upon the home of those who live in that forest. I think you can see where our narrative parallels are taking us. She meets there a local family. In this narrative, represented by bears, the so-called Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. The adventure of Goldilocks starts there as she begins to investigate the realities and indeed the suitability of the various artifacts she finds there. In addition to the idea of Goldilocks, I was keen to share the idea of Lokshin, and this, I say tongue-in-cheek, does not refer to the 20th century composer Alexander Lokshin, but in fact, as mentioned in my early introduction, refers to the picture on your left there. A place filled with the kind of stereotypical narrative we often find about Africa, of unemployment, of inequality, of challenges, often of disease, very often of conflict. So the fascination of the model was really born from not only the inherent contradictions of Africa, but also this fascinating contradiction of golden locks finding themselves in the Lokshin, the location, the place of hypercomplexity, characterized by many of the shadow side that Africa might offer. And so this complexity conundrum of Africa, I argue, ladies and gentlemen, is best served by moving beyond, as Chimamanda Adichie said, beyond that single story towards what one might call tolerable multifactoriality. And what we mean by that is we all know the world is complex. The observation that it is complex alone, of course, doesn't serve us in accessing opportunities and mitigating risk. So we need a sort of moderated multifactoriality, an acceptance, of course, of the fact that more than one story is possible. But we cannot allow ourselves, as talent from Africa, as managers from Africa, leaders in Africa, investors in Africa, and entrepreneurs in Africa, to be overwhelmed by the complexity of Africa. We cannot simply take a stab in the dark. And so Goldilocks and the three bears, established as a well-known archetype, engage here with that Lokshin, that location. Now, I say here, tongue-in-cheek, a reference here to Gaynor Trainer, who argued that it is all about that base. My academic colleagues, I have to say, advise me against the use of the slide, but I know that not all of you listening this morning are in fact researchers in nature. Gaynor Trainer says it's all about the base. You will hear me argue it's not all about the base at all. The base, having said that though, is nevertheless important. What do we mean by an exploration of the base? Simply put, it's what is already there, and you can see a number of those present there. The infrastructure, the geographical accessibility, we can see what's happening there in, for example, East Africa, in West Africa, Southern Africa, and North Africa. The idea of the current levels of mobile penetration, the favorability of the legislative environment, literacy levels rising enormously across Africa, as you all know, the level of socio-political stability increasing over the last few decades, and of late posing a few curious questions about whether that stability is in fact sustainable. The level of policy certainty, classically a conundrum when it comes to issues, for example, of property rights. The degree of consumer confidence, the extent to which citizens are willing to participate in the economy, business confidence, the extent to which investors are willing to participate, and access to essential resources. Now, of course, these establish what you might call the base. That is what is currently in place. But if we were to look at a multifactorial view of Africa, I think the investors would agree that base alone is an insufficient way to think about where the risks and opportunities of Africa lie. And so in addition, what one might do is to consider base in relation to pace. And by pace here, we refer to the relative positive change of various regions and countries in Africa. Pace can, of course, also be negative. And we've seen that during so many civil wars. Pace can also be deceptively rapid. think about, for example, those years immediately following civil wars, in that brief honeymoon period of peace after so many violent and conflictual interactions, where economies across Africa have grown at almost double digits, seen particularly around a decade ago on the continent. So in addition to base, then, we should consider the pace. Now, many investors and entrepreneurs are seduced by looking at either the base or the pace. You can see in the classic sort of oversimplified version there of a scenario building early stage, that there may be those regions and countries, and indeed sectors, that have both a high base and low pace, but there may be others where both the pace and the base may be lacking. The question is, in the full mosaicism, the full fascinating composition of the dimensions of Africa, are even both elements of base and pace sufficient? And I would say they are not. We should add to this rich mosaic a third dimension, something that I've called in the paper the degree of space. And by space here, I mean largely the freedom to operate, the ease of doing business, the liberty provided by the legal system, the degree to which fundamental religious beliefs may be reconcilable between investor and investee, and a number of other elements, including, for example, language accessibility. And you can see now in the construction of this model, when we take that more mosaic approach, a myriad of various scenarios begin to develop. Certain sectors, certain countries exhibit low qualities in each one of those three dimensions, while others flourish on some and indeed all. The base, the pace, but also the space. Now, I went a little bit further and got encouragement from an African Nobel Prize winner, 𝗺𝗻𝗃 Coetzee, and argued that if a sector or country were to present a low base at a slow pace with limited space, if you'll tolerate the rhyming nuance, they present what might be called a disgrace. Of course, they cannot expect meaningful entrepreneurial investment. They cannot expect talent to be retained. They cannot expect businesses to continue a growth trajectory, and they cannot expect youth to contribute their efforts, their energies, their passions in an environment that simply isn't welcoming. And that starts to allude to the probability of certain sectors, regions, and countries reaching their potential in the medium to longer term future. One of the key phrases, often a typical characteristic of narrative, the key phrase that came out of the Goldilokshin narrative is that Goldilocks tries various options, indeed in the same way as investors might in Africa. And what they find, as Goldilocks did, is that some things are too hot, some things are too cold, some things are too large, some are simply too small. What Goldilocks was in search of is something that was just right. That just right principle may be applied on this model by considering those regions, those countries, those sectors that exhibit a stable base, that present an opportunity for accelerated pace, and very importantly, allow for that essential quality of space. And if you'll indulge my rhyming to continue, I suggest that those sectors, countries, or regions may be referred to as the 𝗚𝚻𝗃𝗃. So I was presenting this at a conference recently, and I must tell you, someone in the audience suggested, simply shouted from the floor, that instead of Goldilokshin, I might have to refer to this model as the 𝗚𝚻𝗿𝗶𝗶𝗶 model. And almost instantaneously, someone else in the audience shouted, yes, I saw the signs. So I wonder if you're able, using the Goldilokshin model, to see some of the signs in your industry, in your sector, in your region, in your country, and in the world in which your talent have to demonstrate their excellence. So, the Goldilokshin model, Goldilokshin and the three bears, encourage us to think beyond, to quote 𝗺𝗍𝗃 again, that single story, but presents a humble contribution, certainly not an answer to all questions, but a humble academic and intellectual contribution for considering the way in which those who wish to expand their footprint across the continent and across sectors and regions may think about their investment analysis by considering the base, the pace, and the space. It is time, is it not, colleagues, for us to move far beyond the perspective, as illustrated here by that Bible of capitalism, The Economist, in May 2000, far beyond the perspective of Africa as the hopeless continent. It is time, is it not, dear colleagues, for us to consider in more nuanced ways the mosaicism offered by Africa in its full potential, both its risks and its opportunities. And I trust that you, in your own world, will play with the Goldilokshin model and think where that base and space may present the 𝗚𝚻𝗿𝗶𝗶𝗶. It's been a tremendous privilege for me to share just some of the highlights of this paper, as I said, published by the Finland Future Research Center, and indeed resonating with so much of the fascinating work we do here at the Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development. Now, speaking of those 𝗚𝚻𝗍𝗍, I am joined by two of them, two notable, prominent thought leaders, and I'm going to join them for a conversation in the lounge. I hope you'll join us there, and please, just as a reminder, do share your comments, your questions, your perspectives, your observations in the chat. Give me a moment as I move over to my guests. And here they are, those thought 𝗚𝚻𝗍𝗍 from Africa. Colleagues, both of them, I'm enormously privileged to call them my colleagues and to have them with us on what we might call a thought leadership show here today. So with me, I have Dr. Njeri Mwagiru. She was the founder of the African Futures Desk at the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, a well-known authority on African futures. And I have also with me Dr. Ekene Onwu. He is founding CEO of UXN Design Studio. He's a tech entrepreneur and an award-winning academic technologist and thought leadership. Welcome to both of you. It's fantastic to have you here. I've had my moment now. The audience have had quite enough of my Goldilokshin model, but what they are fascinated in is your perspectives. Perhaps I could just open up for an introductory remark. Perhaps, Njeri, if we could start with you.
Thank you, Morne, and it really is a pleasure to join you and Ekene in this conversation. I think my starting thoughts would be to emphasize one of the key points that you raised, which is we desperately, as Africans and in the broader international community, need to move away, as you quoted our famous author, from a single story on the continent. We need to be able to see the complexity of the continent for what it is and still engage with it in productive, helpful, and positive ways. The other starting thought I had was I appreciate your focus on positivity in the framework, driving us to think of the continent as a place of potential and use the framework and other mind tools and explorations to engage in a way that is beneficial for the long-term futures of Africa. Those would be my starting thoughts, Morne.
Thank you, Njeri. Ken?
Yeah, I think Njeri spoke really well, and so did you. I think the starting point for me really is, I really love the idea that you had around sort of the complexity that exists in terms of doing business, on the African continent, and how we're at a stage where we cannot just sit behind and there's a famous kind of phrase that says one man's meat is another man's poison. And you kind of see the opportunity that exists on the African continent. And I think we've moved away from this idea that it's over complex,
Right.
and there's nothing we can do to tackle these problems.
Right.
So I love the idea of the mosaic, which is something that I think is a danger when we talk about the African perspective. I think there's
Right.
a danger that comes with looking at Africa as one country.
Yes.
Meanwhile, it's a mosaic of 55 different sort of countries and with perspectives on how to do business in these environments. And I think one of the really great things that I really enjoy about the model is that I love models that dig deeper, that look at a sort of multivariate approach towards solving problems. Because I think, like you rightly mentioned, there are loads of these sort of oversimplification
Yes.
ideas.
3 easy steps. Yeah.
3 easy steps, exactly. Or push entrepreneurship and
Yes.
we'll all be successful.
Yeah.
So I really like the idea that there's this concept of understanding that there is a base. We need to understand what's there. And then there's this idea of the pace, which talks about really the tempo and the variability that exists in terms of how quickly different African countries are moving. And then this space that which is really the third dimension, which really talks about, some of the how flexible it is, in terms of like the cultural differences, the space.
Yeah.
What am I allowed to do here?
Yeah.
And it got me really thinking. I think what I really enjoyed, or what it kind of lit up a light bulb in my head. But I think this model is really the foundation. I think, and I said to Dr. Njeri before that, I think it's the first baton in a long relay race. And I think it really provides the foundation for us to start talking about what are the metrics that we're using to measure how effective a particular base is.
Right.
And is it really, truly in every African country a good thing for infrastructure to exist? Now, I'm speaking from an entrepreneurial lens.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
When you look at how you teach a child to swim, you oftentimes don't lecture the child outside of the pool.
Yeah.
You throw the child into the deep end.
Yeah. This is how you learned.
Yes, this is how I learned. As a Nigerian, this is how we learn. In fact, my mother used to do something to us as kids, and there's a thing called omugwo in the Igbo culture, where your mother-in-law and mothers come over to look after your children.
Right.
And there's an interesting thing they do where they turn the baby upside down and they squeeze the different limbs and interestingly enough, what my mom used to do is she used to pour water on my children and say that if you do this early enough, they'll never be afraid of water. And so the concept of swimming really is that you have to throw somebody into the deep end.
Right.
Because you cannot really teach resilience.
Right.
So I think when you look at that framework and you look at the South African context as an example, you look at where we are on that quadrant. There's a really high base when you look at South Africa. Lots of infrastructure, great structures, like really good legal systems, stuff that you don't really find in other African countries.
Yes.
But then you wonder, why aren't all the entrepreneurs sort of blossoming out of South Africa?
Yes, very good.
And you begin to wonder, is it that there are particular traits that you need to be entrepreneurial, to be risk-taking, to be proactive, to do these kind of things that you cannot teach practically for the people who are listening, who are in business. Maybe you cannot teach someone how to be resilient. Maybe you have to take that entrepreneur and drop them in Congo. Not in a fancy hotel when your company has done all the nice things.
I'm sorry to hear that.
These are the safe places you can stay. But no, like, what is the typical life of an entrepreneur in the DRC? You know? And is that something that's sort of positive as opposed to negative? You know, if I see a base with this infrastructure as an investor, traditionally in Western environments, that's great because I don't need to worry about that. But maybe it is detrimental for entrepreneurship in some contexts.
Love that.
Where there's so much, where there's a high level of base, right? So that's I mean, one of the few things that came to mind. But I don't know what you think about.
I love how you sort of that grittiness on the one hand, and how you're sort of using the model to say, look, you know, maybe in sort of traditional, established, large listed organizations, particularly those from outside of Africa, when they look at Africa, the base seems to dominate the perspective. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, what I appreciate with your comments there is bringing up this example of South Africa as a country that may be assumed to be the ace in terms of its base. But you know, thinking around digital transformation, for instance, there is a benefit for having a low base in some countries because that legacy infrastructure isn't there. The phrase that's very popular is, you know, the opportunity to leapfrog. So you're not held back too much by where you've come from. You can look more in terms of the potential. But I would wonder, in terms of your model, if we look realistically at the African continent, you know, is there any country that we could say is the ace of base in terms of these other complexities that you're raising? And how then would we use that A as an aspirational intent? So how do we get to the ace? And it speaks to your point around metrics. How do we measure what an ace country is, or what an ace region is, or what does Africa being an ace in a global community look like? What does it look like? So I think as you mentioned, the framework is a great starting point for a long race in terms of where we need to get to. And
did you just say race?
Race.
I'm going to include that in the model somehow. The ace of base and the long-term race. That's the futurist. That's the futurist. The long-term race.
Exactly. So I think it's a wonderful way to have these conversations and to use it not only as a thinking tool, but also as some level of measurement or as analysis, so that we know where in the race are we. Let's keep thinking of the rhyming words.
I really love that.
Build on this conversation.
Well, perhaps you'd like in the comments to suggest if you think there is a country that may be regarded as
very
an ace.
Interesting to hear.
And also perhaps your views on that long-term race. I wish I'd thought about that earlier, Njeri. That's such a fantastic insight. So if base is the sort of main seduction for the traditional version of investment, what you're saying, Ken, and for those of you who don't know, Dr. Onwu's very impressive PhD looked at the development of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship competence on the African continent. What you seem to be suggesting, Ken, is that from an African entrepreneurial perspective, that base can be sort of a double-edged sword, and perhaps a kind of, with deference to the futurists here, that paradigm of the solid in-place base, if you like. There we go. That paradigm can shift to something where there's this sort of opportunity in spaces where that base is not as established as it could be. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, you got it spot on. And I think, if you look at sort of the research that I was looking into, the challenge that I had was, I also came from the perspective that certain things seemed to be oversimplified because, you know, I have a data background, and at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. So if we're talking about, you know, 9.5 of every 10 startups that are started on the African continent fail within the first year.
Gosh, that's worth just pausing on for just a second. That's what you found in your research?
Yes.
More than 9 out of every 10 startups in Africa fail in year 1.
Correct. And
gosh,
and you know what you hear, or the rhetoric or the narrative that you hear, is that, you know, entrepreneurship is the key. Everyone needs to be driving entrepreneurship and innovation. They're the key to success. And I just thought to myself, you know, if it was that simple, why
wouldn't we all do it?
Correct. And so I basically looked at factors that drive entrepreneurship. So I was really focused on factors that drive entrepreneurship orientation, or at least the mindset, and factors that drive innovation. So really, what makes someone in Kenya entrepreneurial, you know? And really, at the top of that was leadership, really top management leadership.
Right.
Technological competence. I think that isn't talked about enough today. I think we have a lot of business leaders that think technology is something that you sort of imbibe in the organization. But if you look at the CEOs of the top Fortune 500 companies, the Indian CEOs, I'm talking about Satya Nadella and the likes, you look at their backgrounds and there's a change. Previously, CFOs became CEOs.
Yes.
Now CTOs are becoming CEOs.
Oh, I see.
So there's a technological competence that is required to run businesses of today. So there's a leadership or there's a technological component that leaders of businesses today must have.
Right.
It is absolutely essential for you to run organizations in this space that we in this space that we're operating in, right? And the last one, which was interesting enough, was this idea of learning.
Right.
But interestingly, just to your model, and why I thought about the base and pace discussion and looking at how we measure success, or how investors look at these 3 different elements, or at least the elements inside of each one, slightly differently depending on the country, is because all of the literature spoke about how learning is a crucial and extremely important.
Right.
But when I surveyed over 250 startups across Africa, in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and Rwanda, the results were interesting. So they said, no, learning is actually detrimental to my startup's ability to succeed.
That's intriguing. Explain.
So my hypothesis was that it's either the expression of learning that we understand it to be from developed markets, doesn't quite work in the African context.
Right.
This idea of taking the time out to learn new knowledge. Entrepreneurs essentially were saying that it's too hyper competitive to do that.
Wow.
Like if I take the time out to go on a bus or a workshop, I'm losing out.
Right. There's an opportunity cost. It's expensive.
Yes. Yeah. Especially in markets like Nigeria, where you're talking about over 200 million people, where you literally have to learn every day. There is no time to move away and step back, or at least there's the perception that if I do that, I might come back tomorrow and lose my market share.
Right. Gosh.
And so that's why I'm saying, like, I think it's a great foundation. I think the model is really the first step for us to start interrogating, what does that look like? You know, what is a high level base, low pace? 𝗺space look like
Yes.
in Kenya? Is
Yes.
that the combination that works for that particular country? And what does it look like in a country like Nigeria, where power is a challenge, but somehow it has one of the highest level of female entrepreneurs?
It's incredible, isn't it? And
it really
I know,
is.
Njeri, that you have a background also, among many other things, in your rich array of competencies in women's studies.
Yes.
Do you think it's relevant here?
I think it's absolutely relevant, and I was actually taken aback by your sharing of your research finding that learning is not considered as a key factor for success amongst entrepreneurs. But in your explaining, how learning is phrased and understood, and in also your emphasizing that entrepreneurs in an African context are continually learning in order to be in the race, keep pace, not lose market share. I think it's mostly around how would we phrase that capacity? Because I think it would be an oversimplification of a complex dynamic where learning is absolutely, and I say this also as somebody in an academic sector, learning is absolutely critical. And the other one, I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea of just, jumping in the deep end. I wonder if this is not the issue around this high level of failure of startups. What we need to maybe do is have a accompanying approach, or a way in which before you get into the deep end, you can wade into the shallow end. You can have mentors, you can have access to experiences, internships. Maybe what we need to be questioning is what support structures are in place in order for our entrepreneurs to succeed. Because it sounds to me like they're drowning, right? They've been thrown in the deep end and they're actually drowning. And what you want is for entrepreneurs to swim and to create waves, actually, if we build on that metaphor. And from a women's perspective, learning is absolutely key, not only as women entrepreneurs needing to learn, but also systems, structures, processes needing to learn what women entrepreneurs require, and how can the space be created amongst the base for the pace for different approaches to business. So I would definitely want you to do more research around this particular factor of learning and why it's not considered a key success factor. Maybe it's language, as you mentioned, the cultural framing. But I think we need to think seriously around why is entrepreneurship such a struggle? Why are our business people drowning, or our investors? Because we're not swimming, right? According to the data.
I think you've touched on exactly his point, which is the danger of a single story.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think, I don't necessarily think there isn't a place for entrepreneurs to be thrown in the deep end. I think it is essential for longevity. I think with the rapid technological advancement that we're seeing around the world, I think it's a great thing that they're thrown in the deep end. But like I said, I love multifactorial solutions. And I think, to your point, what I was going to get to that I believe is missing is a collaborative, partnership-led approach to entrepreneurship. So I absolutely think they should be thrown into the deep end. But I think the difference, or the reason I believe that we haven't been seeing a lot of them sort of float to the surface is because everybody in the ecosystem has sort of taken a very Western approach, which is let's sit back and watch the entrepreneurs disrupt. And it doesn't really work that way. I think you need to have investment in the entire ecosystem. So where you would find in, for example, in a Western environment, a startup would go typically to a VC and ask for a particular amount of funding to run their business, and you would raise, for example, $2.5 million for 15% of your company to do X, Y, Z in fintech and health tech and agri-tech as an example. On the African continent, what potentially needs to change is when Njeri comes to ask for funding for, $5 million or $2 million for a particular business, maybe what we need to be saying is, what exactly do we want to use that $2.5 million for? Because if 80% of it is to increase your base, right? Because you lack the infrastructure, as an example.
Very good.
Then maybe I, as an investor, potentially need to put that money into the business that sits in the base, as opposed to giving it to the startup,
And
create collaboration and an ecosystem that incentivize the person or the businesses that sit on base to actually do something. Because, you know, if you raise money, there's always an angle that you need to, you know, sort of move in. And so that idea that you raised, Njeri, is really what I was getting to, which is to say there needs to be more collaboration and more partnership. In fact, in South Africa, it's more dire, because if you look at how strong the corporate organizations are in South Africa, it's almost detrimental to entrepreneurs, right? You know, because really entrepreneurship and the strength of corporates are like a marriage made in heaven. They're meant to work together. In fact, it's incumbent on us to do it. Otherwise, we just end up creating silos of oversimplifications all over the show.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
So
I really love that that ecosystem idea. In fact, in systems thinking, we often say that that there's a direct proportionality between the level of the level of connectedness in the ecosystem and the resilience of that ecosystem. So I wonder if we could migrate a little bit from that base to the pace and say, well, you know, the pace for more than 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs is really kind of a you know, start with a bang and all sorts of excitement, and then quickly you know, quickly it's gone. So pace is also something that perhaps requires a longer term perspective. And Njeri, this is where I'd like to hear from you from a futures perspective. Do you think you raised that longer race idea?
Yes.
Do you think that's relevant on the pace dimension?
Yes, I do. And in the pace dimension, I think this idea of dynamism and momentum is important. It's an environment. As you mentioned, so the pace brings in this idea of dynamism, which is also a wonderful aspect of the model, the idea that it can be continually used as a lens for understanding. But as you link in the model, in order for there to be pace, you do need that space, right? You need the space for reflection about, you know, which direction do you want this pace to develop. So momentum is important to understand. Cultural context, business environments are not static, but they're dynamic. But also to understand that we don't need to be overtaken by the pace of developments in the world around us. We don't need the pace to drive us. We can set our own pace.
Oh, I love that.
In a way that's comfortable for the spaces we occupy, for the level of base we want to develop, or how we want to engage with the base. So the idea of pace also being something that we have agency over. And this is a key future thinking principle, that there's so many trends. The world is so complex. There's so much happening. If we look at the African continental free trade area and that whole push towards integrating the continent and the challenges around that, we need to be able to look and think, how do we create a pace that is suitable for our context? How do we shape this race, or maybe even get off the track altogether and start a tennis game? Right? So I think the idea of pace is something where we need to focus in terms of our agency and not feel or not react in a way that is impulsive simply because of external forces and driving factors that we need. It's very important to engage with them. Speaking around digitalization, for instance, and your research demonstrated that it's important that there's leadership and technological competence. But there's so many other competencies required as well. And I think one of them is being able to make astute decisions in terms of direction you want to go, how fast you want to get there. Should we all be running towards a precipice in terms of industrialization models? No, maybe we want to take that pace and pull it back, way back. That would be my contribution from a futures lens, and bring in that idea of momentum. And
I love that really very disruptive perspective. And you'll know, Njeri, that we've already started toying at the Institute of Futures Research with the idea of the fifth industrial revolution.
Yes, we have.
You know, which is quite distinct from the fourth. So let's move into that space idea just a little bit. We know for entrepreneurs there's this idea of limited space, or at least they feel often that way. Of course, there are many other key role players in the ecosystem, to use your language, Ken. There's the role of government, and I think it's not unreasonable to say that governments played a very dominant role in the way that so many African countries have developed this kind of state-centric philosophy. There's the role of big business, not necessarily the entrepreneurs, but the incumbents. There's the role that universities could play. There's the Quangos, the NGOs, and other players in the system. Do these other role players have a role when we think about creating that space, or are we simply hoping government will come up with the next more palatable policy?
Yeah,
government. You gotta.
Yeah, we're on the easy questions now.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I would encourage you to speak freely.
Yeah, I think the government one, I mean, this might be slightly controversial, but I think at times there's an over-reliance on government.
Yeah,
at times.
Right. Yeah.
And the reason I'm saying that is because I think there is an over-reliance on government because there's an under-reliance on the partnerships and the collaboration that must exist in the ecosystem.
Oh, that's very good. I have to say, I've never quite heard it articulated quite so well.
Yeah.
That the explanation for the government over-reliance is that under-reliance in that ecosystem.
Exactly.
That you described.
So you know, I think Dr. Njeri mentioned it yesterday in the work that she does, where she was talking about this idea that there is a huge African diaspora, and you know, what she was saying, you know, quite clearly was that there isn't really a vehicle for them to put their money to good use on the continent.
Right.
And I think that is a symptom of a greater issue, which is this idea that the accelerators are not talking to the universities.
Right.
And the universities are not talking to the infrastructure
holders.
Yes. And we're not creating solutions for the entrepreneurs.
Right.
Because in my view, I think because of the gift, the human capital gift that we have on the African continent, I almost believe that entrepreneurship should be like YouTube studios.
Right.
Where you walk in, there's a green screen, there are cameras, you don't worry about those things.
Right.
You come in and worry about product market fit and the quality of your product.
Yeah.
Very good.
So we almost need to do that at a macro level.
Right.
And it's not just the nice thing anymore. It's not just a nice to have.
Right.
You know, it's almost like when you wanted to start a company and the banks would tell you, well, to open an account, you need to go to CIPC. No, it's like, no, I'm coming to you. Because I'm a business person and I want to make money tomorrow. Don't tell me to go somewhere else to register my business and like make the ecosystem work. Right. And I think that's the challenge, because it requires us to talk.
Right.
It requires us to engage. It requires us to have difficult conversations. And we oftentimes shy away from that. It's very easy to blame the government, even though the government could do more, as we know.
Yeah, always.
But
I think that's fair.
there are environments where they have, and still, like, things aren't
Still hasn't happened?
Yeah.
Perhaps just before we go to the chat, finally to you and Njeri, from a futures perspective, Ken spoke about this government dependency. we know about this fascinating demographic profile on the continent. We know that includes this enormous gap between the age of most leaders and the average age on the continent.
Yes.
Do you think the younger generation will perpetuate this trend of a government-dependent paradigm, or are you seeing signs that perhaps there's this separation happening from this government-dependent mindset?
So let me answer that from the lens of complexity.
Right.
I think on the one hand, if we look at space, cultural realities of the continent, we are, and this is, I suppose, a generalization, but we could draw, I suppose, generalities across African cultures from this perspective. We're multi and intergenerational, and we do have structures in terms of those age groups and what we believe is possible by different generations. So there hasn't really been space for the youth to engage from that cultural perspective,
right?
Because it's assumed that engagement will come as you age, as you mature, as you gain wisdom, as you become more knowledgeable. But there's a lot of pushback from the youth, simply in terms of numbers alone. They are the majority of the population on the continent, and there's frustration because of the expectations of what government can do, is not doing, should do. And those frustrations are targeted, I think correctly so, at our leadership.
Right.
But more than looking at a disjuncture between the generations, I think we should look at this intergenerational, multi-generational concept. And how do we accommodate that? Maybe we need to look at, the state structure and go back to, Westphalia, and when the states were introduced as a way to organize at a macro level. Is this still relevant, not only for the continent? Is this still relevant for other international contexts as well?
Right.
You mentioned that CTOs are becoming CFOs, so a technological, but we can see increasingly that many presidents need to have some kind of corporate, not military, just to be military, but some kind of corporate exposure, some understanding around the economy, capital growth. And I think that I think is the interesting conversation. Are these macro structures, as states as we understand them, are they coming to their maturity, or are they perhaps beginning to decay, and we need to think innovatively around how else can we organize?
Gosh, very challenging, very broad brushstroke futures kind of questions. I think you can see, colleagues, why we have the luminaries here that we do. I wonder if we could move to our chat. We have Krishna, who says, what would the 𝗚𝚻 base look like for digital transformation in Africa, and more specific, Southern Africa? Ken, I know you had a bit of a look at this. Do you have a thought? Do you think that this 𝗚𝚻 space model is particularly relevant for digital transformation specifically?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's where I think it's in that environment that it really shows its strength. And I know she was asking kind of what would that look like in Africa, and more specifically Southern Africa. I think to a degree, I think we've got to look at the 𝗚𝚻 base in the Southern African context, where I think we move from a particular point. So I think, they always say, or the previous rhetoric was that Africa was a dark continent.
Yeah.
And hopeless.
But I would say that I wouldn't say South Africa is data deficient. In fact, I would say South Africa has a high level of maturity when it comes to capturing data.
Right.
But they are data insights deficient.
And
I think
that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the nexus between data deficiency and data insights is technological leadership. So I think the 𝗚𝚻 base and what it looks like in the Southern African context is someone saying, how do we take all of this great infrastructure and great structures we have in the legal system? How do we flip all of this on its head, right? To make space for the entrepreneurs.
Right.
How do we unlearn things that we've known to be true and not, because sometimes there's too much structure isn't a good thing.
Right.
So you've heard people say that the only real innovation takes place in Africa. The only real revolutionary innovation takes place in Africa.
Yes.
Everything that's happening elsewhere is evolutionary.
You're right, right.
And that's really because of this idea that I think we're too comfortable with, in South Africa, or at least in Southern Africa, with the idea that we have really great systems. And to my point earlier with Dr. Njeri is, so because we have all of these great pillars and systems, entrepreneurs don't really, the resilience thing that is required to see that patient money that is needed, that time that you need to invest in doing the same thing over and over and over and over, and like a mad person hoping that in the year 13 is when you finally break even or turn the corner. That I think is what we need to be doing from a Southern African perspective.
Right. That's an interesting distinction to make between data deficiency and data insight deficiency. And I love the implication that you're both driving, which is, let's not be so blinded by the base, because the base is, there's only so much you can do about that.
Absolutely.
So Vernon asks, what are your thoughts on the true self-determination possibilities for Africa? And Njeri, you spoke about the importance of agency, and some of you will know I've done some work on this for mindset purposes. Vernon says, what are your thoughts on the true self-determination possibilities for Africa in the face of the conspiracy theorist view of Western and Eastern influence and hidden control, the sort of, the new colonizers from the East and so on, grabbing hold of the continent. Does that mean anything for our sense of agency in Africa? Does that mean anything for the space, if you like?
Yes, and this actually brings, and thank you for that question, it brings into the conversation this other element that I really like about the framework, which is the conversation around narrative and stories. So, of course, too much of anything is not a good thing.
Sure.
So too many stories, unfounded in data, or with not enough insights around the archetypes of that story, what that story means, can be problematic.
Right.
And that's where we have the issue of conspiracy theories. That's where we have stories being misapplied in ways that don't use the data or corrupt the data on purpose in order, for different reasons. And I think that narratives are a very powerful tool. So in response to that question, it's very important to be able to set your own narrative and tell your own story. But there needs to be moderation, right? That story needs to be truly reflective of the content that story reflects. It needs to be reflective of that content in accurate ways, even if we use metaphor and symbol. It needs to be rooted in data and in some form of reality. In futures, we love to use our imaginations, and we're big believers in the power of creativity. But creativity accompanied by rigorous academic processes, science, data, analysis, and insights from those analyses as well. So I think, of course, Africa has got agency, but how are we telling our stories, and which stories are we allowing to influence the ways in which we do business or we understand the context? So narrative is powerful, but it can be abused. Very good.
I love how both of you are emphasizing this idea of data and the metrics that may follow on the model. So perhaps if there's an aspiring PhD student listening, perhaps you'd like to develop some of the metrics around the Goldilokshin model.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Great model, Morne.
Yeah.
How do I practically apply this model in my world as non-academic? I sell muffins. I'd like to internationalize and sell muffins globally.
Yes, become a muffin mogul.
Exactly, muffin mogul. How do I use this kind of model in practice? Now, I would say we can have the humility to say that we don't know, which is absolutely fine. But as the creator of this model, I'm sure you have some ideas that are conversation starters about what you believe the real practical implications or really core examples of how you think this model could play out.
Well, I'm tempted to sort of use the CIA phrase and say, I think you'll find I ask the questions here. Yes, and you're right. I have no claim to the full answer of that, but I would say if you're using a deliberate mom and pop shop to make it as complex and difficult for me as possible, and you're a well-trained PhD provocateur, but I would say that you know, and at the risk of oversimplifying it, but at least we have multiple dimensions here. If you're building your muffin business, it's important that you, using the insights I've now learned from the two of you, it's important that you don't say, well, what's the market for muffins as the base? That's a terrible base question. Correct. Because it's not very original, it's not very imaginative. It's sort of the way that a large European investor might think. Correct. If you're a muffin business in Africa, you have to think a bit differently about the base, especially about perhaps what Akov calls errors of omission. In other words, what's missing in the base? And therein lies perhaps some of the entrepreneurial opportunity. The second thing I would say on the base is you cannot ask the traditional large Western organization question of how fast is the muffin market growing? Because in fact, that's you're operating in a model that just doesn't work in this world. You may be data deficient in your region, you may be data insight deficient, and so it's much more interesting to ask what are the opportunities, right? It's much more interesting to ask who buys 100,000 muffins, and to go and find that market. And then on the space, I would say, don't be disillusioned by the fact that government policy makes it difficult for you to be an entrepreneur. Don't be constrained by all the baking regulations if we're getting into your world here. But think about, in strategy, I often ask clients this question: how is the world asymmetrically structured in my favor? We know that the world is asymmetrically structured. How is it thus structured in my favor? So in other words, if you're hoping to find the space for your muffin business, look for the space where and using your ecosystem idea now, you look for the space where you can connect with others in a similar ecosystem. Absolutely. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that's a recipe. Forgive the pun on the muffin, but I do think that if you think differently then about that base, about the pace, and about the space, at least you're beginning to sense some of the opportunities. Add a bit of imagination, and there might be some opportunities to be found there. Let's hear from Dr. Chris van der Hoeven. He says, what models have worked in similar context to ours? That's the sort of internationalization question. Is Malaysia an example? He says, what about Indonesia, Singapore, perhaps? I spent a lot of my time in developing economies and have seen, as both of you have, countries that seemed at one point to have no base,
and quickly develop,
and rapidly, create that pace and create that space, as indeed all three of Chris's examples have done. Dubai is another example. All of these have shadow sides also. But do you think there's something we can learn, that Africa can learn from some of these international examples?
There's always something to be learned. So let me preface my response with that. It's always important to look at other contexts, try to get a sense of what's best practice, what might you be able to gain from their successes, their failures, etc. But I want to add to Ken's queries around the practical application of a model, and it's also in response to what Chris mentions there. There is a danger, isn't there, Morne, with engaging in a complex context and attempting to add a model to capture that. Right. So the process in itself is simplifying in to some way.
Of course.
So there's a limitation to models, is my point. Yes. Look, the more models you have, the better, as in order to have that partnership, collaboration, a different lens, etc. But it also, when we think about models, then we quickly get this idea that we can cut and paste. This model worked very well over there. Let me take it, fully as is and plonk it in this context and try to make it work for me. And I think that it's important to learn from other contexts, but to realize, especially in context of Africa.
Right.
That there are unique elements. The space is not going to be the same, right? Those more intangible aspects of a business environment.
Absolutely.
That's where we tend to actually get tripped up, because we assume that, all of the elements were in place for this model to work. There are all of the elements available for the model here, yes. And yet, and we're in this juncture. So I think it's important to see which models work, best practice, but to recognize the limitations.
Right.
And what I like about this particular model is because it engages in story and it has a level of dynamism, and we've added race now, that we're moving somewhere, that we're going somewhere. Yeah. It's a way to open up the conversation. And you mentioned it a bit earlier in the conversation around needing to go into the different elements of each of those quadrants. And I think if you use the model in complex ways, then that's where the real value comes in. So we have space, base, all of that, but let's actually take pace and really get into it. What does pace look like in this context? Get the data, get the insights. Then I think that's when you ensure that your models are not being used in simplistic ways, even as they are offered as a way for us to engage productively in complex environments.
Very good. I have to say, Chris, in my own experience in clients in Saudi Arabia, that country, even less than a decade ago, was considered a black box. Very few people knew anything really about how to develop industry. And when you look at what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is doing there with the Public Investment Fund, it is extraordinary how, with an almost zero base, there's a bit of space created, and this is where the complexity becomes fascinating. Of course, when you present the model, it looks like you're just talking about three things, but in reality, it is exactly correct, and it is interactive. So you create the space, and suddenly the base goes up, and the base goes up, and suddenly that drives the pace. And as the pace grows, more space is created, and you see this kind of circular reinforcement, Chris, in a model like the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia. Hendrik says, as a citizen of one country in our African continent, what tools are available for me to better understand the base and space of other countries on the continent? And perhaps Hendrik is also saying to us, go and do some more work on your model here, Hendrik, and it would be a fair thing to say. So it's not an unusual question, is it, Ken? I'm based in one country. We know that Africa free trade area is expanding. I'm a citizen in one country. I'm an investor here. I'm an entrepreneur here. Is there anything that I could use to help me understand the base in pace in other countries, perhaps target countries, investee regions? Any thoughts there?
Radical one, go there.
I love that. I love it. We often say that
good advice.
any new business coming into Africa, the first 100 days
just immerse
is a person and a kettle. That's it. Don't launch at the convention center with doves and balloons and sandwiches and t-shirts and half-naked acrobats. Just go there with a kettle, walk the streets. I mean, it's a great principle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I was looking at some of the insights, call it secondary insights, not primary insights of my study was, we asked these entrepreneurs and these startups, how many of them were educated locally, and how many of them were educated abroad, and whether that had an impact on their ability to succeed.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
What did you find?
We found that there was no difference between those who were educated locally and those who were educated internationally.
That's really fascinating. I'm going to pause you there because I do think that we have this, often this paradigm in Africa of it's better outside.
Correct.
If you've been trained there, then surely, come back to us and share your tremendous wisdom. And you found that there's little evidence of that.
Very little evidence that indicated that an Ivy League graduate
Right.
And to that point, the reason I'm saying go there is that there's something to say about indigenous entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
There's something to say about being on the ground, being in that environment, especially when you talk about the African continent from the perspective of not having data. There is really
Right.
no website you
Right.
can go and click
Right.
and look for these
Yes,
indices that measure base, space, and space.
Yes, yes.
And that will
Not
give
yet.
you, not yet, but they don't exist
Right,
today.
yes.
And there's something to say about the African culture of Ubuntu, of oneness, of conversation. And
Yes.
it could be that the information you seek is inside the mind of the CEO.
Very good.
Who will only give it to you when you sit next to him.
Yeah.
Very good.
Right. So it isn't, unfortunately, today,
Yeah.
doesn't exist somewhere on
data
Google,
set.
in a data set.
Yes.
Or in a database.
Yeah.
It sometimes has to be created. So sometimes you're looking for insights
Very
about your
interesting.
business.
Yeah.
Talk to
You
someone.
don't talk to someone.
Yeah.
There
What a
isn't-
radical idea. Yeah.
There isn't somewhere, where, there isn't a great repository of information where you
Yeah.
can find, like, there are times where you Google and it says, did you mean, or
Yeah.
couldn't find what
Yeah,
you were
yeah,
looking
yeah.
for.
Yeah.
Those do exist, but you kind of have to, that budget you had on the holiday that you
Yeah,
were going to
yeah.
like use that and go take a flight trip to Cameroon
Gosh, yeah.
and immerse yourself in the culture and understand how people survive.
Very good.
yeah.
I think it links to your idea earlier of data insight deficiency, because what you're saying is there are other ways of,
There are other ways, yeah. And to expand on what you're sharing, because not everybody has the means to travel, but talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And there very likely is somebody in your immediate environment, given how, how Africanized so many African countries are. There are very often Africans from other countries in your country, in your space, in your neighborhood or close by. So get to know your community, get to know the people in your ecosystem. And if you can, of course, travel and expose yourself to the environment. But talk to people, get the insights from within a lived experience that you have access to.
Right. And I guess we could ask our audience, how networked are you in your ecosystem?
Absolutely.
I'll allow perhaps one final question, and this is that's GID. I'm not sure if that's an abbreviation. It says, in relation to the supposed modern East or Western colonial tech age in Africa, how can we, as tech immersive Africans, taking your idea of walk around, immerse yourself, how can we as tech immersive Africans drive the need and adoption of these disruptive technologies, such as generative AI, virtual augmented reality, blockchain, edge computing, and so on, without losing the intention and direction to promote the African tech renaissance? And how can these technologies be practically adopted into learning systems at the ground level? So technology is often viewed, if I'm interpreting the question a little bit, and I like the supposed modern East or Western, colonial tech age in Africa. This is a question we often get in working with clients across. Is Africa different? And I have to say, when I start with the assumption that Africa is different, it takes about 30 seconds before someone says, but are we really? Are we not one humanity? And then in the next session, when I start with, we're all one humanity, it takes about 30 seconds before someone says, well, are you sure? I mean, did you really discuss the ancestors when you were working in London? So the fascinating question here is, how do we as I like that phrase. This is a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Tech immersive Africans. How do we drive the need and adoption for these disruptive technologies? Should we even do it? Is it the right course of action?
I think there's a lot in that question, as you point out. I think my response, and I would love to hear what you have to say about it, Kenneth. My response would be that we shouldn't assume that we are not in it. So, African exceptionalism really can be a problem. It's about finding that balance. We started the conversation around needing to acknowledge complexity. And I think that includes not drawing hard lines in the sand, around, tech exists here, tech is adopted in this other environment. These are the creators of tech. These are the users of tech.
Right.
We're all in it together. That really is my view. And while we want to use, helpful models to understand cultural context, we can take that model at different levels of analysis as well. So you can look at a community, you can look at a country, you can look at a region, or you can look at the world. And maybe the provocative question to ask is, where are the best tech innovations coming from? Where are the revolutionary innovations coming from? We might find a lot of them are being driven by the African continent simply because of need, social development requirements, economic innovations that are shaped by the unique aspects of our context. But they can be easily exported to international environments as well. So I would say that it's important that we realize we have that agency. We have that agency to be involved in the world of tech and AI and to contribute to it, both as users, as creators, as people in businesses around it. So I would want to, in response to that question, not have that dichotomy or that very strict division. Of course, there's a digital divide, and the digital divide is most pronounced on the African continent. I don't want to, sweep over the challenges that we face, but I also want to acknowledge that some of our, youth innovators are creating and innovating in amazing ways, And I think the question is, how do we adopt them into learning systems on the ground? So let's talk more about application of tech. And are we applying the best tech for our context, and how can we encourage that? And I would love to hear your response to that.
Njeri.
There's a lot of evidence to support what Njeri's saying, isn't it? I mean, the GSM data says there are only over 400 tech hubs now, all across the African continent.
700 now, 600 plus.
A dramatic growth in the last few years. How would you read it?
I think she said something at the end that really sums up my thinking on this issue, which is, I think the problem, or the problem statement, I don't think we spend enough time on the problem. I think we kind of talk about the idea that, we're aware of the problems in Africa, and we kind of take that stance. But I think, very similar to the strength of a sort of PhD study, or the strength of your model, it really falls flat if there is an oversimplification understanding of the problem. And I think the issue we have, and to that question, on the African continent, is that we haven't had the agency to tell people about the problems that we have. So oftentimes you hear people saying, when will the next Facebook, or when will the next Apple, or when will the next Google come out of Africa, or Uber come out of Africa? And I wonder, is that the right metric? Shouldn't we be talking about, when is the next Instagram of agriculture? Because it isn't, for us, we're not at a stage where social media is going to be the top business on the African continent. We have greater, more complex, wicked problems on the ground that need solving. And I think we need to have a more authoritative voice when it comes to AI, virtual, like, how do we apply these great technological advancements to our unique problems?
Very good. You're proposing agrigram.
I like that. I actually like that.
Exactly.
Let's take photos of mini meal.
There we are. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating learning from both of you, ladies and gentlemen, and we've come to the happy end of our fascinating discussion here. And to our guests, our delegates online, we'd ask you, are you blinded by the base? Are you curious about new ways of accelerating the pace? Are you creating more space for entrepreneurs? Are you integrated into your ecosystem? Are you taking the leadership required to take Africa forward? Are you a technology leader? Are you learning? Are you talking to people on the ground? And if I may add, are you curious in taking this model and doing your own PhD on it? It's been an absolute privilege being with you, and what you can expect, colleagues, over the next year is that we'll have a number of these webinars. We will continue to explore the dynamics of Africa. We really do look forward to your future engagement with Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development as we continue to discuss these extremely relevant issues. So let me thank my esteemed guests, and I think you can see why these thought leaders were invited today. They were Dr. Njeri Mwagiru and Dr. Ekene Onwu. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Lovely to have you here.